Lauderdale. They've been behind our programming and our educational sessions for years, and we really wouldn't be able to be here without them. Also want to make a call out to Q Digital and to Pink Media, who've really helped us connect to the community and make this symposium available free for everybody. A little bit about CMI, you know us, but I'm Tom Roth. I'm the founder and president of community marketing. I started the company in 1993. You'll be hearing from David Paisley in just a moment. He's our senior research director. He'll be presenting the Black LGBTQ Community Survey with our panelists. And then Lu Jun is our research director. She's not online today. She's on Shanghai time, in Shanghai, but she's still very much an integral part of our team. We're a full service LGBTQ focused market research company. We build our studies based on a very diverse and community representative panel of 50,000 LGBTQ consumers. And we serve corporate, university, organization, and government institutions. These are just a few of our clients over the years. And I couldn't have imagined or dreamed of such success back in 1992 when we started the business. So now it's time to move on to our session. If you want to tweet about it, then you have the Twitter, and I'm going to turn the screen over to David Paisley, who will pick it up from here and present the Black LGBTQ Community Survey. Take it away, Dave.
And Tom, there's a chance Earl dropped off, so you might have to rebring him in.
Okay. Yep.
Alan, just give me a second.
Earl's back on.
Great. All right, and hopefully that is all on. And hello, Cassandra and Earl, my co-partners on this research. Actually, I'm going to be talking a little bit more and about the sort of the background a little bit of the research. But actually, Earl, I thought maybe I'd turn that over to you, because really this started because of you. So talk a little bit about what your goals were and how this all happened.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. The reason why the Center for Black Equity, we wanted the survey is because, and actually this partnership started in 2014. And you were recommended to us through some colleagues who had experienced some of your expertise and thought that we could use some of that expertise to do a first ever consumer survey for the Black LGBTQ community. And in 2014, we worked together, we collaborated together, and we felt it was a very positive collaboration. We had some consumer information, we had some social information about the Black queer community that we've never had before. And we actually had numbers, because when you're looking at, if you're looking for grants, if you're looking for sponsorship, they want to see numbers. And we didn't have any numbers until we engaged in this, the consumer survey with you in 2014. Mm-hmm. And in 2020, earlier this year, I was just thinking, I said, you know, it's been a long time since we've done this survey, and it's COVID-19 and people are home. Maybe it's time to revisit it and see where, you know, where things have changed, if things have changed, if they haven't, where they have changed, just to get a barometer of what's going on in the Black queer community. And we approached you again, and you were willing to work with us again and lending us your expertise again. And we believe that we have another successful product, thanks to you and your expertise.
Thank you, Earl. And I should have actually started this. I think maybe all three panelists, including myself, should introduce themselves a little bit. I've been on earlier cards, but my name is David Paisley. I'm the Senior Research Director at CMI. I've actually been with the company for over 20 years. I coordinate all the research projects, and I've actually done right now, I think like in a 320 number of LGBTQ research projects over the last 20 years. So I've done a lot of them, but this one is sort of near and dear to my heart. I think it's been a great project involving a lot of people, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Cassandra, I'll turn it over to you next. If you could unmute and just introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure, thank you so much. And 320, that's an impressive number. So I'm Cassandra Cantave. I actually work for AARP. I'm a senior research advisor. Been with the organization about 18 years. I lead the LGBTQ work for research. And I also am the chair of our employee resource group. And this research is definitely very near and dear to me.
Great. And Earl, please introduce yourself. We didn't have a chance to do that before we.
Well, I'm Earl Fowlkes. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for Black Equity, which was founded in 1999. Our organization initially started working for the first 15 years of our existence with the 45 plus Black gay prides around the country, and actually not including the 8 around the world. And in 2012, we were called the International Federation of Black Prides. And in 2012, we changed our name to the Center for Black Equity and broadened our outreach and broadened our membership. And we're working on the 3 pillars of social equity, health equity, economic equity. And I also have done some, I was the chair of the Commission of Human Rights for the District of Columbia for 6 years. So I've been doing human rights work and HWA's work for the last 25 years.
Great. And thank you to both of you for being here. And I just want to acknowledge, first of all, that this particular project isn't quite ready for distribution. This is the first presentation we've made with it. It will actually be released on December 1st. I'm still working on a lot of the data and putting the final report together. So this is just more of a little preview. So I want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge the 4 sponsors that made this fiscally happen and their commitment to the community. And that includes AARP, but also Freddie Mac, HRC, and Wilson Media Group, who were sponsors. So a little bit of background about the survey. This survey is representative of the Black LGBT community that is sort of out and interacting with the LGBT community, either through media or through events or different organizations. And I think that's important to understand, is that we had over 1,800 people participate in the survey. And the survey group came from a little less than half from CMI's LGBTQ panel, but the other half came from almost 60 organizations that, you know, put out the message that the survey was happening. So I want to thank the many, many organizations. These are some of the media organizations that participated, but also thank Earl and the many, many Black prides across America who also participated and put it out to their lists. So in the end, we got about 1,815 people to participate in the survey. For those of you not familiar with research, we often weight data when it's a little bit demographically out of balance. And this one wasn't so bad. We had about 50% were cisgender, gay and bi men, 40% women. What we do is tend to, through weighting, even that up. And we naturally had about 10% from the transgender and non-binary community. Also, this particular survey did trend a little bit younger. That's not uncommon with LGBTQ research, but particularly when we're working with the Black and, say, Latino community and Asian communities too, they tend to trend a little bit younger than overall LGBTQ research. So we even that up a little bit too, because we don't want when we talk about all the LGBTQ results, we want to make sure that we're representing all 3 major generations, not just overwhelmed with millennial and Gen Z responses. I also want to acknowledge that this is true of the African-American community as a whole in America, but it's also true of this group, is the group did trend more urban. So most of the participants lived in big cities or medium-sized cities. We did definitely have some from the suburbs and small cities and rural areas, but you do need to acknowledge that because I think where you live influences the results. So the goal of this particular talk is for me to just talk a little bit about a finding we had. A lot of this is the first time Cassandra or Earl even see any of these slides. And I want more Cassandra and Earl to comment on what their reaction is to the finding from a professional viewpoint, but also a personal viewpoint for what you're seeing in the community. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit is this is something we did back in 6 years ago. And this is the question, do you connect with more with the Black community, the LGBT community, or both? And choose what best applies. We made them choose a result. And I think what's true 6 years ago and is true today is that's a little bit all over the place, is that we're seeing that when forced to make a choice on a question like this, is that about 38% choose equally, but a good percentage connect more with the Black community or connect more with the LGBTQ community. So there's this intersectionality between Black and LGBT, and we'll talk about that more and more as we go through. But Earl and Cassandra, I'd love for you to just comment about that. Does this feel right to you, or what do you think about a slide like this?
Go
ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Cassandra.
I think for me, the thing that's striking, and this is the first time I've seen this slide, is that 10% that don't have much of a connection to either community.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand why these results are showing up the way that they are, because as you know, in the Black community, especially certain generations, there is a stigma attached to identifying as being LGBTQ. And so oftentimes you have people that feel like they have to choose one or another depending on the situation and the environment and the people that are in those environments. And so I think that's why we're seeing that 27 to 22%, which was the same as in 2014, a little bit the same, you know, and not having a huge group that says, well, I identify with both. And I think that there's a level of comfort that a person needs and support that a person needs when they are Black and identify as LGBTQ to feel comfortable in both spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly echo those remarks by Cassandra. And for me, this explains why Black prides exist. Is because for the Black LGBTQ population, Black Pride is a place where you can celebrate both being Black and being a queer, and you don't have to code switch, and you don't have to you can feel comfortable and you can celebrate both without feeling like you're compromising yourself.
Okay. Now we asked a series of questions about, does your local city or town support you as being part of these different communities and the intersectionality between Black and LGBT? And it was interesting. We asked, how supportive does your local community, you know, support the local LGBTQ community? And 70% of the participants said that their local towns and cities were supportive of LGBTQ community. But then we asked how supportive they are of their local Black community. It falls all the way down to 55%. And then if we ask how supportive of you, how supportive is your town of the local Black LGBT community, it falls all the way down to 42%. So this was a theme in the research that we saw over and over again, is that people felt that their LGBTQ identity sometimes was more supportive and there was less discrimination than within the Black community. Now that's very different for the transgender community, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But a slide like this, I think, is really interesting, especially when you look at where a lot of these folks are living in sort of big cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia. I'm wondering, you're particularly Earl, as you're working in these different towns, how do you feel about a slide like this?
Well, you know, it's interesting. It shows the housing patterns for our community are residing. The fact of the matter is, in places like DC, Philadelphia, and both places I've lived, Black people tend to live in Black neighborhoods. So there's certainly homophobia and transphobia is more prevalent. I shouldn't say more prevalent. It displays itself more readily in Black communities than in other communities. And if you're fortunate to live in the gay community, which is very, very safe for you and very welcoming for the most part, or you're living in a area there's not as many Black people, these findings make sense. It makes perfect sense knowing where people live and where our community lives. We don't have a Black gay Mecca community. We live in other communities. And I think that depending on where your economics, what you can afford, you move to places that, if you can afford to, that are going to be safe and relatively supportive. And if you can't live in those places, you're going to live in places that perhaps a bit more hostile environment and a bit more unsafe. And these findings make perfect sense to me. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I'm
Cassandra.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to echo what Earl mentioned. And also, I think, you know, that's why in a study like this is so important, because if you're looking at the narrative, right, of comfort in your community for the LGBTQ community, or support, I'm sorry, the slide switch, support, right? And if you're looking at just that number, it seems like, okay, most people feel comfortable or supportive, that their communities are supportive of LGBTQ folks, right? But that could just be, you know, when you're just looking at general market LGBTQ folks. And then when you get down to specifically Black LGBTQ, you see that there's such a disparity. And so a study like this really illustrates the true narrative.
Mm-hmm. And the next slide, and I'll have you actually comment on the next slide, is, but I just wanted to throw this out there, is that 92% of their survey participants feel pride in being an LGBTQ person. And I think there's a context here, is that obviously we're recruiting from media organizations and Black prides and social organizations where people are a little bit more out. And I think an online survey like this is not likely to attract many people who are not very out or are maybe not feeling a lot of pride in the organization. So there's some context in a slide like this. But I am happy to see that 92% of the survey participants feel pride in being an LGBTQ person. And it wasn't that different when we looked at all the different demographics. But, you know, while Black LGBT participants feel pride in being an LGBT person, they can't really fully be themselves at work, school, or neighborhoods. And many don't feel real connected to LGBTQ social or political organizations. So I think what's interesting here is, it says, if you're, as an LGBT person, can I be yourself at work and school? And less than half agree, and then some somewhat agree. And the same is true with neighborhoods. But the last one I think is really sort of concerning. And the question is, I feel connected to LGBTQ social or political organizations. And only 29% that they said that they definitely agree, and 36% say that they somewhat agree. So I'll actually turn this over to Cassandra as a person who's part of not an LGBT organization, but a big organization in America. How do we make LGBT people and Black LGBT people feel more connected to our organizations?
I think through doing research, right? Promoting and advocating for LGBTQ folks, but also showing up in, you know, in nonverbal ways, right? In our pamphlets, in our magazines, in our spokespeople, and having people that look like them, like truly representing them, right? So if we're talking about Black LGBTQ folks and you're doing advocacy or outreach for this community, then actually have imagery that shows to people that are, you know, it's obvious that they belong to the community, right? And I know that's kind of the oxymoron, because it's like, well, what does LGBTQ look like? But an actual couple, not imagery that looks like people that could be friends, could be, you know, siblings. So I think all of those things really help. And one of the things that struck me about this slide is, I wonder if these this data would look differently under a different political and social environment.
Yeah, I think that's important to say, is that we launched this survey in a very strange time in America. You had the election.
2020 is very strange.
Right, when what happened, everything with police violence and Black Lives Matters. I mean, all that comes to play with how people were thinking and responded to this. Earl, I'm also curious about you, as you've worked with a lot of different organizations. When you think, you know, we don't, not necessarily naming names, but if you look at like the big LGBTQ organizations out there, how are they doing with connecting with Black LGBTQ people?
Well, according to this, not very well. And this makes sense because these organizations are perceived as being white LGBTQ organizations, and if whether real or imagined, have not been seen as being allied with Black queer issues. And there are very few Black specific LGBTQ organizations, social or political. And so if, you know, I'm involved in a local political organization, and I've served in leadership for that for 6 years. And we finally have gotten a lot of younger Black queer people to get involved in the organization. But if I look at the environment throughout the country, most of these organizations are predominantly white and have done very little to attract Black LGBTQ people. And then many of them will say, well, we welcome Black folks, but you know, I say you have to go out to a community and bring them in and welcome them, and not only welcome them, but go and reach out to them and say, we want you to come to our meeting. These are the times, and escort them into the meeting and make the meetings welcoming and acknowledge their presence. And until these organizations do that, if we do a survey in 5 more years, it's still going to look the same.
Okay. All right, a little bit about acceptance. And what I really want to bring out in this slide is particularly that, and this is a big theme of the research, is that we break it out to the L, G, B, and T. You're going to see within the research that all discrimination and acceptance slides, it falls way down for the transgender and non-binary communities. So like here, I can be myself in my neighborhood. 56% of the cisgender lesbian women say yes, but it drops 20 points, and that's huge, 34% for transgender and non-binary participants. So I'd love you to comment a little bit more about what can organizations do and cities do to make their environments, you know, safer and also better for transgender and non-binary people in the Black community.
Well, this has been a reoccurring theme for many years. And it's very complex because it's not what cities, it's really about, it's cities, many of these cities, the many urban areas have protections for LGBT people, and especially T people. These issues have been discussed in public policy and public meetings, but it's really the community that has to change, and changing, you can't legislate people's behavior. And having laws to protect LGBTQ people, especially T, many cities have these ordinances, and but the reality is the people have to be accepted. I want to put it even more base. People have to leave people alone and mind their own business. And it's just mind your own business. A transgender person living in an apartment next to me or living in a house next to me does not impact my life or lifestyle or anything at all. So why do you care? And it's just disempowered groups oftentimes try to take power away from other people. And this is an example where the community turns onto members of their own community. These are black transgender women and men live in Black communities mostly. And so they're just want to have a life and have a family and live just like everyone else. And the fact that there are people in the community who are willing to deny them this. So what has to happen is organizations such as my organization and other organizations, we have to keep talking about this. Even though I'm not transgender and I don't understand what it's like to be transgender, they're a member of my community and I'm obligated morally to defend transgenders, transgender people and their reason to exist, and they don't have to explain why they exist. They're human beings and we need to stand up for them. And until more people like myself continue to stand up for these our transgender sisters and brothers, this is going to continue. This has to stop. This is absurd. It's morally absurd.
Yeah, I think Earl, said it eloquently. The only other thing that I would add to it is that organizations, not just like the Center for Black Equity, but all organizations need to normalize, LGBTQ, especially, transgender and binary images, people, advocacy, research, just the whole gamut, so that it doesn't seem like even within an organization that you're dismissing a whole population of people because you don't understand, you don't know what to do with that data, whatever the case may be. But we need to normalize all people.
And I just want to add one more thing to this, David. It's not just people who are lower economic income or education who are the ones who need to stand up. It's people who are my peers and Cassandra's peers who say things, and my friends know they can't say things about transgender people in my presence. And when they do, I said, that's not correct. You can't say that. You can't, and you certainly can't say it around me, but you shouldn't say it at all. We need to check our own privilege because it comes with privilege. And I think, and classism. And I think we need to acknowledge our privilege and classism and work within that to make sure that we stand up for those people who don't have the same privilege and who are not in the same class as we perceive ourselves to be in.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to talk about 3 slides that sort of go together. And I think it's interesting from even from a marketing perspective, if corporations are on, is that we ask the question, what best describes your current relationship status? And we see here that there's a big gender difference, is that at any given moment, the cisgender, lesbian, bisexual women are more likely to be either married or in a relationship than the cisgender men are. And the transgender non-binary participants tend to be in between the cisgender men and women. So I bring this up, first of all, is that within the male community, the Black LGBTQ male community, there's a lot of single men right now. And that matters how they answer response to questions, but it also matters of how you might market to this group. We also asked this question about who do you actually live with? And again, as we would expect, living alone is higher with the cisgender gay and bisexual men. But the other thing I really want to point out about living alone is that almost 50% of the Black LGBTQ baby boomers live alone. So there's a lot of potential social isolation with older LGBTQ people. And I know that's work that AARP does a lot with. And the final thing with this slide group is that we asked, how has COVID-19 pandemic impacted you? And the number one by far that's impacted them is it's impacted their social health, and it's made them feel more socially isolated, right? So I'm going to turn us on to Cassandra first and talk a little bit about what you're seeing at AARP with COVID-19 and social isolation, and also how that might relate to the Black LGBTQ community.
Well, I think as I was looking at those numbers, I was wondering how they compare to just African American Black folks in general, because there is, I believe, higher numbers of single African American Black older adults that are not married, that are living alone. It also, those numbers are actually very similar to our Maintaining Dignity, where it was general population, gay men tend to live alone, have smaller social supports, and I could just imagine the mental health impacts this is having on this community, because what we know is with social isolation, and David and I, we talked about this recently, social isolation has the same health consequences as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, right? So you have mental health and physical health outcomes. And, I say this all the time. We are on the verge of a huge mental health crisis when we come out of this pandemic, and I hope that one of the things that comes out of this is we can find some sort of strategies to really support our LGBTQ brothers and transgender and non-binary folks, because I shudder to think of what that's going to look like on the end of this.
And those issues are certainly going to go well beyond just the Black LGBTQ community. It's
Indeed.
Almost every community is dealing with this.
Indeed. However, but as we know, the Black LGBTQ community is likely to fall lower on the totem pole of who's being reached, who's being advocated for, and who the outreach is for. And so I think, as a collective, we definitely need to come up with some strategies.
Okay. All right, moving on a little bit, I'm going to have Cassandra just talk a little bit about this too, being from AARP. But I thought one of the things that's really interesting is we asked some questions about moving into assisted living, and we asked these people who were either 45 or above or 55. There's a lot of fear of discrimination on race and ethnicity, but also sexual orientation, and then for transgender people, gender identity. So the concept of moving into assisted living is really, really fearful for our community. And do you have any recommendations of how to get beyond that, Cassandra?
One of the things I know that there are, people like Sage, they're creating different indexes to find places that are more accepting. There are some LGBTQ, well, they say LGBTQ housing, assisted living facilities, but there's all types of policy and things happening where these housing facilities are not all LGBTQ, right? But I definitely think,
there's just as much fear about race and ethnicity, about discrimination in those facilities too.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think it goes back to the conversation we were having before, people feeling like, well, like I say, in the age of this whole outwardly discrimination, blatant discrimination happening, I understand why the numbers are so high. There's elder abuse And this is stuff that, we've looked at for a while. And, I definitely think that there needs to be some policy implications. There needs to be, more of these scorecards specific for LGBTQ folks.
Sure.
And if I just may want to add one thing into
Sure.
that, I think part of the issue is that it's the staffing at these facilities. Many of them are from are immigrant communities because of a shortage of workers in the elderly centers, senior centers. And many of them come from places that are not very tolerant of LGBTQ folks. And I've heard many stories of abuse and prejudice and.
Are you still there, Earl?
I think he froze a little bit.
Okay, well, I'll move on here and hopefully Earl will be
Can I
back with
also
us.
say one other
Sure.
thing? I think also as a community, when we have friends and family that are in these assisted living situations and facilities, that we need to rally around them to ensure that they're being treated fairly. Yes, there are organizations that can do the work, can create policy, but it is really up to an individual collective, right, to support our family members and our friends and our family of choice, to make sure that they are being cared for in the right way, especially our transgender participants.
Sure. And Earl, I don't know if you're back in. I see your face moving a little bit. I think you're getting a bad internet connection right now. So jump in when you get back in. A little bit about education. One thing that really struck me about the survey, now it is true that any research, regardless, that is outreaching through organizations and media will have a higher level of either a bachelor's degree or higher. And in this case, we had 48%. But even if you look at people who are going an associate's degree or vocational school, one thing that really struck me about this group is really values education. So I think that was really interesting. And I don't know if Earl or Cassandra could talk a little bit about that. Is almost like with the LGBT Black community, really there's maybe a cultural, but not bias, but a cultural reason to really value education and want to get more education.
Oh, Earl's back. I think one of the things is that, from a young age, African-American Black folks, we are taught, you have to have education, you have to have certification, in order to combat some of the discrimination that you're going to face. And when you are Black and identify as LGBTQ, you've got 2 strikes against you, right? So if you're Black and you're older and you're, LGBTQ, now you've got 3 strikes against you. And so I think it's a matter of trying to control the external outcomes by trying to, get more degrees, more money, more status, so that, it could diminish some of the discrimination that you're going to feel.
Yeah, and I think that's something for people to keep in mind, is that they're outreaching to the LGBTQ Black community through organizations like the Black Prides or through these media. You're talking to a really well-educated group. And I think I heard Earl about to say something. Okay, I think Earl's in and out. One thing I just want to really point out too is that the household income side, when you look at the average household income for the general population, Black community, it's roughly, I think, about $46,000 for household income. This particular group came in higher at $55,000. We would expect that because of the education levels. But I also want to say, from a discrimination standpoint, is that if you look at the level of education and the type of places where the folks were coming from, like Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia or New York or Los Angeles or Dallas, these income levels are really quite low, quite frankly. So I see a group that has a lot of education, but perhaps not being compensated for that education in their income levels. And then the other thing I want to point out, I'll have Earl come in, he's back, and I'll talk about this, is the other thing that I really see here, especially with millennials, a lot of student loans out there. And I know that's a big conversation with young people today, But it really struck me is that the level of student loan debt for young Black LGBT people is pretty high.
Well, because of income disparity.
And unfortunately, Earl, I think
Yeah.
you're just clicking out there. So sorry about that,
Oh,
Earl.
wow.
Yeah. So I think
You might want to turn your video off. That might help you a little bit.
one of the things I think what Earl was going to say, not to put words in his mouth, is that, oftentimes with, Black and, Hispanic Latinos also, is you go to school, you're saddled with debt. And when you come out, you're in this hole, and your income, entry level is not going to be high enough for you to pay down that debt. In a way that's manageable. And so what you'll have, and it probably will, dovetail into this, what you'll have is you're going to either try to defer your student loan so you can buy a house, or so you could pay for a car, or so you could just live.
Sure.
I agree with that 100%. That's exactly what I was going to refer to.
Very good. And you're clear now, Earl. So that's cool.
Thank you.
We only have a few more minutes. And I want to actually take this to the end and have Earl talk. And we have lots of other issues. And this is just a preview. There's so much more to this study when we actually release it. But as we end up here, what I want to talk about here is that we ask questions, companies that support racial equality are more important than ever, and this group very much agreed with this. Companies that support LGBT equality are more important than ever. This group very, very much agreed with it. But we ask if corporate America is doing a good job outreaching to the overall Black community, or the overall LGBT community, or particularly the overall Black LGBT community. Really poor. Only 4% agree with that, right? So Earl, I would love you to respond about where do we stand as a nonprofit, and also as someone who's working with all these Black prides that are trying to get sponsorship. Where do we stand with the Black LGBT community and getting that sort of corporate and organizational support?
Very, very.
All right, and Earl is knocking out here. I'm not hearing him here. So I apologize about that, Earl. Seems we've gotten some bad internet at the end of this, but what I'll say, and I think not for me putting words into Earl's mouth, is that we're not getting a lot of support. And we see this with the Latinx community, and also the African-American community, and the media and organizations out there, is that you're just not seeing a lot of corporate support. And it tends to come from two groups. It tends to come from alcohol and HIV meds, right? But you're not seeing a lot of support beyond those two corporations.
Can you hear me?
You come in and out, Earl, unfortunately.
When you go to Community Pride, you see all these corporations, but when you serve the LGBT community,
All right, Earl.
that you can't hear me.
Yeah, we're getting every third. So anyway, I'm going to finish this up. Earl's around to have questions, but the thing I really want to stress is that this report will come out around December 1st. It's going to be far, far, far more extensive than you're looking at. And we're going to be doing a much more extensive webinar about this in mid-December. We're going to bring in our other partners like HRC and Wilson Media and Freddie Mac, and we're going to talk about a lot of these different issues that are out there. So the thing I just want to stress as I finish this up is that there are media out there. I mean, as I started this presentation, we had over 60 LGBTQ media and organizations that are out there that are supporting the Black LGBT community. And if you're a corporation on here, they need your support, and it's a great way to connect with them. So we asked some questions about the types of media that people are looking to, and also the different types of organizations and parties and events that the Black community is going to. Both Black Pride events, but also, festivals for the entire Black community. So all that data is going to be out there. We're going to finish this up and turn it back over to Tom. I want to thank Cassandra so much for being here, and thanks to Earl. And please outreach to all of us on this topic. And again, we're going to have a much more extensive webinar coming up, I'd say, in about 3 weeks. And everyone who's been on here will announce that too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave. That was excellent. And also thank you, Cassandra, and to Earl. As Dave mentioned, there's a lot more to this, and we're going to be really delighted to dig even deeper into it. So this was really meant to just whet our appetite, I think, and get everybody involved in this conversation.